If someone had told me last year that I'd be uninvited from Thanksgiving in my own childhood home, I would have laughed and said, "No way, not my family, not after everything I've done for them." And yet, there I was, standing in the middle of my sleek, sun-drenched kitchen in Boston, holding my phone with the kind of stunned silence that only comes when someone you love stabs you with a smile on their face. The call had started like every other Sunday check-in with my father, a casual routine I'd maintained for years, despite the undercurrent of favoritism that had always flowed beneath our family dynamic. I had just finished transferring $8,000 to cover my parents' annual heating bill, a gesture I never mentioned and they never thanked me for. It wasn't the first time I'd helped. It probably wouldn't have been the last. I did it not for praise or recognition, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my aging parents shivering through a New England winter in a drafty colonial house they refused to modernize. "You get the receipt?" I asked, my voice light but hopeful. I'd emailed the confirmation that morning. "Oh yeah, saw it earlier," Dad said, as if I'd just reminded him we were out of milk. "Thanks for that." A second of silence passed before he continued, as casually as if he were talking about taking the trash out. "Oh, and Sarah, don't come home for Thanksgiving this year. We've got a full house. Emma's fiancé is bringing his family, and you know how tight the space gets." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. I paused, the steaming mug of coffee in my hand suddenly too hot to hold. "Wait, what?" I asked, trying to laugh like it was a joke I wasn't in on yet. "You're kidding, right?" No, he said, chuckling softly. "It's not a big deal. We just have limited seating, and with the Duvals coming, well, Emma wants it to be intimate. You understand." It took every ounce of restraint I had not to let the heartbreak spill out all at once. I stared out the window at the golden leaves fluttering across my backyard, and the ache in my chest began to bloom like frost spreading on glass. My father wasn't joking. My invitation had been revoked, not because of a mistake, not because I said something wrong, but because there wasn't enough space. Because Emma's future in-laws were more important. The call ended without ceremony. No warmth, no apology. Just a perfunctory, "Talk to you later," as if we hadn't just severed something vital between us. I stood there, motionless, my thoughts unraveling like a thread caught on a nail. I thought about the lawyer meetings I'd skipped vacations for, the hours I poured into my career so I could be the kind of daughter who never asked for anything but gave without limit. I thought about the plane tickets I'd bought every year to fly home, the surprise gifts I'd had delivered to their doorstep, always under the guise of just because, and the monthly payments I'd made when Mom said the roof needed repairs or Dad's medical bills got too high. I gave because I loved them, even if I never felt quite loved back. But this, being uninvited from the one holiday I clung to, the one time of year where I let myself hope for warmth and togetherness, that broke something in me that I didn't know was still intact. And it wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was what Thanksgiving represented. It meant belonging. It meant home. And now I was being told, without a trace of shame, that there wasn't room for me. Suddenly, I remembered how Emma had always been the chosen one. The golden child with the soft voice and endless list of accomplishments our parents never stopped bragging about. When she flunked out of her first semester of college, they called it a much-needed break. When I made partner at my law firm 2 years ahead of schedule, they said, "That's nice. Dear, have you met anyone yet?" I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't in this for the applause. But it does matter being seen, being acknowledged, feeling like you're not disposable. And in that moment, as I stood alone in my silent kitchen, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit before. I've been disposable to them for a long time. The worst part was that I had spent the last 3 weeks daydreaming about the trip home. I imagined us sipping wine in the living room while the fire crackled and Dad told one of his too long stories. I pictured Emma and me laughing over pies, pretending the past didn't matter, just two sisters making new memories. I saw myself placing the heating bill confirmation on the kitchen counter and hearing Mom say something like, "You're a lifesaver, sweetheart. We're so lucky to have you." But those were fantasies. Scripts I'd written in my head to cover for the truth. And the truth was that Emma was bringing her wealthy, picture-perfect fiancé and his equally polished family, and my parents didn't want me there to ruin the aesthetic. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my presence didn't serve their image. That realization sank into my bones, heavy and permanent. That night, I didn't pour a glass of wine or call a friend to vent. I sat on the couch in silence, laptop in my lap, and started searching flights. Not to go home, but to go anywhere else. Somewhere warm. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could be alone and not feel lonely. Because loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about being forgotten. I'd always told myself that I was strong, independent, that I didn't need them the way Emma seemed to. But even the strongest people have breaking points. Mine just happened to arrive on a quiet Sunday morning, wrapped in a phone call that told me I didn't matter. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. But something else stirred beneath that grief. A slow, deliberate flicker of clarity. If they had space for Emma's in-laws, but not for their eldest daughter, then maybe it was time I made some space of my own, away from expectations, away from their selective affection, away from a house that had always felt more like a museum than a home. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had even started bleeding through the blinds, the familiar hum of the radiator whispering in the background as I lay there, eyes wide open, mind still locked in that single, gut-wrenching moment from the day before. I couldn't stop replaying it, my father's voice, so casual, so dismissive, telling me not to come home for Thanksgiving as if I was some distant acquaintance who'd misunderstood their place in the social hierarchy. Not his daughter. Not the woman who had been quietly paying their heating bill every November like clockwork, without expectation, without fanfare. Just because I thought that's what love looked like. By the time I made it to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter kind that clings to the back of your throat, I knew I couldn't let it go this time. I had swallowed so much over the years, passive-aggressive remarks, dismissals masked as jokes, the way Emma's every mediocre accomplishment was treated like a coronation while mine were quietly filed away, forgotten before the ink dried on the congratulations card. But this, being erased from a holiday I once helped make magical, was too much. So I did something I've never done before. I opened my laptop, logged into my utility accounts, and stared at the scheduled heating payment I had set for my parents just 2 days ago. $8,000, neatly processed, labeled Annual Service Payment. My finger hovered over the Cancel Payment button for only a breath before I clicked it. Just like that, the transaction reversed. Just like that, the warmth I had been trying to give them for years, literal, financial, emotional, was gone. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. They didn't see me. So I stopped showing up in ways they never even realized they needed me. I sent no message, no warning. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to notice. I wanted to know if their love came with conditions I had failed to meet. The week trudged forward slowly, each day colder than the last. It wasn't just the weather that shifted, though Boston had entered that unforgiving pre-winter chill where the air bites at your skin and the sidewalks glisten with early frost. It was something in me that had begun to crystallize too. My anger had turned into resolve. Not rage, not even bitterness anymore, but a quiet and devastating certainty that the people I had been calling home for decades had never really offered me one in return. By Wednesday, the forecast had dipped below freezing in Connecticut, and I knew what that meant. Their old colonial house, with its ancient windows and creaky pipes, would be starting to shudder in the cold. The kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes the walls feel like stone. Still, not a word from either of them. No texts. No calls. No one wondering why their heat hadn't kicked on the way it had for the past 10 years, like an invisible hand cranking the thermostat for them. Maybe they hadn't noticed yet. Or maybe they had and decided not to give me the satisfaction of reacting. Either way, I waited. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and brittle, a thin layer of frost on the windows of my townhouse. I made myself a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, eating in silence while the radio murmured soft jazz into the room. My phone remained still until noon, and when it finally buzzed, I almost didn't look. It was Emma. The message was short, blunt, and entirely on brand. Did you seriously cancel the heating payment? Mom and Dad are freezing. This is beyond petty. Call me. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, and then did the one thing I knew she wouldn't expect. I called her. She answered on the first ring, her voice already sharp. Sarah, what the hell is wrong with you? I exhaled, slow and steady, like I was walking a tightrope over a canyon of every holiday we'd ever pretended to like each other. Is that how we're starting this? I asked. Not even a hello? You left Mom and Dad without heat, she snapped, skipping right past civility. They're walking around in coats and gloves inside the house. You're punishing them because you didn't get your way. A humorless laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I'm punishing them? Emma, they uninvited me from Thanksgiving like I was some neighbor who RSVP'd too late. I'm their daughter. You're being dramatic, she said, voice thick with disdain. It wasn't personal. It was about space, about logistics. You think everything is about you. No, I said, voice low and steady now. That's you. That's always been you. I've spent years bending over backwards to hold this family together. I've paid their bills, filled in the emotional gaps, cleaned up messes you didn't even see happening. And all I ever wanted in return was to feel like I mattered. There was silence on the other end. Just the faint sound of wind through her end of the line. I've been paying that heating bill for a decade, Emma, I continued, slower this time. And they never once said thank you. Not once. You think this is about a dinner table? This is about a pattern. About a life spent being useful, not loved. Emma scoffed. So what, you're going to freeze them out to make a point? No, I said, suddenly so tired. I'm letting them feel the cold I've lived in for years. There was another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her processing the weight of my words, could imagine her lips parting to form the rebuttal that never quite arrived. You know what? She finally said, her tone colder now. You're just bitter because no one ever put you first. I didn't flinch. Not this time. And that right there is exactly why I stopped trying. Then I ended the call before she could say anything else. Before she could twist the knife again. That night, I didn't turn on the TV or check social media for pictures of their perfect, curated Thanksgiving. I lit a candle, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in the quiet warmth of my own home, where the heat clicked on like clockwork because I had paid for it myself. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty about choosing my own comfort over their convenience. Thanksgiving morning arrived like an uninvited guest, sullen and gray, the kind of day that never quite warms up no matter how high the sun climbs. The sky outside my townhouse looked like bruised porcelain, streaked with silver clouds that promised no light, only wind. I wrapped myself in an old cardigan, thick and comforting, the sleeves stretched from years of reaching too far for people who rarely reached back. Inside my home, the radiator hissed softly, a gentle white noise that filled the space like a low lullaby. The warmth it gave off felt earned, like a quiet nod of gratitude from a house that knew I had chosen myself this time. I brewed coffee the way I liked it, dark, with a splash of oat milk and a dusting of cinnamon, and let the steam fog the kitchen window as I watched the leaves outside dance in the chill. I should have felt peaceful. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Not regretful, not ashamed, just hollow. This was the first Thanksgiving I had ever spent alone, completely and intentionally alone. No airport delays, no casseroles transported in precarious foil-covered dishes, no awkward hugs or forced laughter around a table with people who treated me like a well-funded stranger. Just me and the sound of the wind rattling the edges of the window panes. Just me and the knowledge that, right this moment, my parents' dining room, the one I painted for them 3 years ago, was full of people pretending not to notice the way their breath fogged in the air between sentences. I could imagine it too clearly, and that haunted me more than the solitude. Emma, perched at the head of the table like a queen regent, doing everything she could to maintain composure as the temperature inside hovered somewhere between fridge and freezer. Her fiancé, Mitchell, probably still in his perfect wool overcoat, trying to smile through chattering teeth while wondering why his girlfriend's parents hadn't planned better. And my parents, my mother layered in cardigans and disappointment, and my father clutching his wine glass like it might provide heat if he held it long enough. And still, I hadn't heard a word from them. Not a single text. Not a single call. It was as if I had been removed from the story entirely, the same way you tear out a damaged page and keep reading like it was never supposed to be there in the first place. I tried to distract myself with things that had nothing to do with family, reading, cleaning, scrolling mindlessly through recipe blogs, but everything seemed to echo back to the same emptiness. Every dish I saw reminded me of Thanksgivings past, of laughing in the kitchen with my grandmother, who used to call my pie crusts too perfect to trust. Every click of the thermostat reminded me that their heat hadn't come on. Not because it broke, but because I had stopped being the person who fixed everything without being asked. Somewhere around 4 in the afternoon, as I sat on the couch with a book I wasn't reading and a dinner I hadn't bothered to cook, my phone rang. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The screen read Dad. Just that. No heart emoji, no saved nickname. Just Dad. I let it ring once more before answering. "Hi," I said, my voice flat, neither cold nor warm. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that made you wonder if the call had dropped or if someone was trying to figure out how to start a conversation they didn't want to have. "It's cold here," he finally said, his voice thin and quiet. "I know," I said, keeping my tone even. "It's late November in New England." Not exactly a surprise. Another pause. Then, "The heat didn't come on this week." I thought maybe the system was broken. But Emma told us what happened. So that was it, Emma had told them. Not because she thought it would bring us back together, but probably because she needed someone to blame for the way the evening had unraveled. The image of her trying to host a dinner in a 38-degree dining room, plastering on a smile while her guests whispered behind their linen napkins, brought no satisfaction. Only sadness. "I canceled the payment," I said. "It was a decision, not a mistake." He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, there was something raw in his voice, something I hadn't heard in a long time. "Your mother wore 3 sweaters." Emma tried to keep the food warm by reheating everything in the microwave between courses. Mitchell's father made a comment about rustic charm. He laughed bitterly. We were humiliated. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the couch. And yet no one thought to call me before today. "We didn't know what to say," he admitted, and then, softer, "I didn't know how to say it." The silence stretched again, heavier this time. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said. "I just needed someone to notice that I've always been there. That I mattered." "You always did," he said, but the words came out stiff, like he didn't quite believe them even as he spoke them. "It's just easier to lean on the one who never says no." "That's not love," I said quietly. "That's convenience." He exhaled slowly, and for a moment, I could almost hear the years settling between us like snowfall. "I'm not proud of how we handled things. I'm not proud of a lot, actually." I wanted to ask him why it took frostbitten fingers and a ruined dinner to realize any of it. I wanted to ask why warmth only mattered once it was gone. Instead, I said, "The cold has a way of showing you what's missing." He didn't answer right away. Then, with something that sounded almost like shame, he said, "It's been missing for a long time, hasn't it?" "Yes," I whispered, feeling the ache of it fill the space around me. "It has." When we hung up, nothing had been resolved. There were no promises made, no sudden clarity, no warm reunion. Just a thin line of connection, fragile and strained, like an old pipe groaning under the pressure of too many years of silence. The morning after Thanksgiving, the sky was still thick with the color of old stone, and the wind outside rattled against my windows like it was looking for a way in. I hadn't planned to get dressed or make plans or even open the curtains that day. But something about my father's voice the night before, the way it cracked around the word, humiliated, had settled into my chest like a question that refused to be buried. He had called not to demand or defend, but to confess in the only way he knew how. And though it wasn't an apology in its full form, it had been a crack in the wall, small, imperfect, but real. It was enough to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, something more was possible. By mid-afternoon, I found myself staring at my suitcase, wondering if I should pack it with anger or hope. I wasn't sure which one would get me through the day better. In the end, I didn't pack much, just a thick coat, an old scarf, and a voice that had spent far too long being silent. The drive to their house was achingly familiar. The same highways, the same brittle trees lining the road like they were standing guard over memories I didn't want to revisit. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in spirit. As if the cold had shrunk it down into something less than it used to be. Or maybe I had just grown beyond it. I stood at the door for a long moment before knocking, my breath clouding in front of me, the air biting at my fingertips. When the door finally opened, my mother appeared, wrapped in a blanket like it was armor, her eyes puffy from a night spent trying to pretend things weren't broken. "Sarah," she said softly, her voice lacking the usual sharpness. "Come in. It's still cold." I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet stirring something ancient in my chest. The heat was back on, I could hear it humming low in the vents, but the warmth hadn't fully returned. Not in the walls. Not in the people. My father was sitting in the living room, a fire now crackling in the hearth like an apology that came too late. Emma stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, which for her was rare. For once, there was no smugness. No careful arrangement of words designed to wound without leaving marks. "I'm not here to fight," I said, before anyone else could speak. "But I'm here to say what I should have said years ago." I sat down slowly, my hands folded tightly in my lap. My voice trembled at first, but I didn't let it falter. I had carried these words for far too long to leave them unspoken now. All I ever wanted, I began, looking from my mother to my father, was to feel like I mattered. Not just when I was useful. Not just when you needed something from me. I wanted to be seen not as the strong one, not as the one who always lands on her feet, but as your daughter. My mother looked away, blinking hard, her lips pressed together like she was trying to keep her guilt from spilling out. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You've spent years praising Emma for things I was never allowed to struggle through. I worked myself into the ground to prove I was worthy, and it never once felt like it was enough. I became the responsible one because no one ever offered to catch me if I failed. And even when I succeeded, it barely registered. I felt my voice catch, but I didn't stop. Canceling the heating bill wasn't about punishing you. It wasn't about vengeance. It was desperation. I needed to know what it would take for you to feel my absence." Silence swallowed the room, thick and unrelenting. Then my father lifted his head, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes meeting mine with something I hadn't seen in a long time, humility. "You're right," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've always been the one holding everything together, and we took it for granted. I don't know how to explain why we did, but I can tell you this, we were wrong. Deeply, shamefully wrong." My mother, still holding her blanket like it might shield her from the truth, finally whispered, "I never realized how much I leaned on you until the warmth was gone." I nodded, because there was nothing else to say in that moment. No need to pile on. No need to gloat. The words were enough. Then Emma spoke, and for the first time in what felt like years, her voice wasn't coated in sugar or condescension. "I didn't understand," she said, her arms falling to her sides. "I thought you were trying to ruin things for me, Thanksgiving, the mood, everything. But I see now. I see what we did. What I did." I looked at her, uncertain. "I'm not going to pretend we'll fix everything overnight," she continued. "But I'm sorry, Sarah. Really. I think I've spent my whole life enjoying the comfort you bought without ever wondering who paid for it." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them, not from sadness, but from the staggering weight of being seen, even just a little. Emma sat beside me on the couch, and for the first time in a decade, it didn't feel like a performance. She reached for my hand and squeezed it, gently, hesitantly, like someone learning how to touch a wound without causing more pain. The three of us sat there, surrounded by a room that had once held so many unspoken resentments, and for a brief moment, the frost began to lift. In the quiet days that followed our long-overdue conversation, something in the air between us began to shift, subtle at first, like the way early spring thaws the edges of snowdrifts. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no cinematic gestures or emotional outbursts, no promises scribbled on the backs of napkins or declarations of everlasting change. But there was something I hadn't felt from my parents or Emma in a very long time: intentionality. They didn't try to rewrite the past, and they didn't pretend that one conversation had undone years of imbalance. Instead, they started listening. Not the kind of listening that waits for an opportunity to speak, but the real kind, the kind that feels like a door finally creaking open after being locked too long. I spent the weekend at their house. Not because they begged me to stay, but because I wanted to see if this new way of being could hold. Emma made breakfast the next morning, and for once, I wasn't the one silently cleaning up behind her while she told stories about her life. My mother sat beside me on the couch that evening, her hand resting on mine in a gesture that once would have startled me with its unfamiliar tenderness. And my father, usually the one to disappear behind his newspaper or television screen, asked if we could walk the backyard together, just the two of us. He said very little, but the silence between us no longer felt so loaded. It felt like something was being rebuilt in that quiet, not forced, just gently laid down like the first stones of a foundation. On Sunday night, before I left for Boston, I logged into my laptop in their kitchen and pulled up the utility account I had once closed in a moment of fury and heartbreak. My mother sat across from me at the table, hands curled around a cup of chamomile tea, watching me not with expectation, but with a kind of nervous hope. "I'm going to reinstate the payment," I said softly, my fingers poised above the keyboard. "Not because I feel obligated, but because I believe in what we're trying to build here. But it comes with something I need you to hear clearly." My mother nodded, her eyes glistening. She didn't interrupt, which in itself felt like a small miracle. "I need to be seen. Not just when I'm useful. Not just when someone needs a favor or a bill paid. I want to be part of this family as an equal, not as the safety net, not as the fixer, but as a person with limits, with needs, and with the same value you've always given so freely to Emma." She exhaled slowly, then placed her mug down with a soft thud. "We see that now," she whispered. "And we want to do better. You have my word on that, Sarah." And I believed her. For the first time in years, I actually believed her. So I reactivated the account. The $8,000 payment went through with a soft ping, but this time, it felt different. It didn't feel like a silent sacrifice slipping into the void. It felt like a contribution to something that might, just might, be reciprocal. The year that followed wasn't perfect, but it was progress. My parents called, not to ask for things, but to check in, to share bits of their day, to invite instead of expect. Emma and I started texting again, not just out of habit, but out of choice. She even came to Boston once, just for a weekend, and we spent a long afternoon walking along the Charles, talking about the childhood we remembered so differently and how we might rewrite the ending now that we were old enough to see each other clearly. By October, I received an envelope in the mail, not a text, not an email, but a handwritten invitation with a watercolor pumpkin on the front and my name written in my mother's careful cursive. "We would be honored to have you at our table this Thanksgiving. Come hungry. Come loved. Come home." I stared at it for a long time, letting the words settle over me like a warm blanket on a cold morning. There had been many years where I would have cried reading something like that, not out of joy, but out of the ache of wanting it for so long. But this time, my eyes stayed dry and my heart stayed steady. Because this time, I knew it wasn't performative. It wasn't guilt-ridden. It was real. When I arrived at the house on Thanksgiving Day, the wind had a bite to it, but the sun was shining through the bare trees like it was trying its best. Emma opened the door, wearing a ridiculous apron that read, "Too blessed to be stressed," and for the first time in our adult lives, she pulled me into a hug that didn't feel obligatory. Inside, the house was warm, not just because the heat was working, but because the energy had shifted. There was laughter in the kitchen, a playlist of soulful jazz drifting through the air, and a set of place cards arranged carefully at the dining room table. Mine was right in the center, nestled between my mother and Emma, with a tiny heart drawn next to my name. During dinner, my father raised a glass, his voice clear but a little shaky, and said, "This year taught us a lot about love, about humility, and about how warmth isn't just something that comes from the furnace. It comes from how we treat the people who show up for us year after year, even when we don't deserve it." He looked at me then, not with guilt, but with gratitude. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like a guest in my own family. I didn't feel like the backup plan, or the silent helper, or the invisible backbone holding everyone up. I felt like a daughter. And this year, that was enough. The chill that had once lived in the walls of our relationships had finally begun to melt, not all at once, but steadily, like spring finding its way back to frozen ground. And in its place, something real had begun to grow. Warmth. Mutual respect. Maybe even love.